Welcome back to the deep dive. If your business runs on the cloud, and let's be honest, pretty much every modern company does these days, then this deep dive is probably one you don't want to miss. It's your critical security blueprint.
Yeah, we've pulled together a huge amount of information, really focusing on the most, well, infamous, high-impact security incidents in AWS history.
But here's the twist, the really startling fact right up front. We're not really here to talk about Amazon's mistakes.
Exactly. When you actually dig into the official reports, the postmortems, the vast majority of these huge breaches, they aren't caused by some fundamental flaw in AWS itself, in their core infrastructure.
It's how the customer uses the service. That's the key.
That is absolutely the single most critical distinction you need to grab onto. We're not looking at, fancy zero-day exploits against AWS's network or hardware.
No, we're talking about basic configuration errors, sometimes ancient access keys nobody remembered, profound failures in just, well, internal governance.
Right. So our mission today is to dissect these major security disasters. We're talking code spaces which just collapsed entirely, the massive regulatory mess at Uber, Capital One, and pull out the foundational, actionable lessons, the things that really govern your existence in the cloud.
Because what all these sources show, again and again, is that the sheer complexity of modern cloud setups means one seemingly small customer mistake. Maybe leaving a test server open or a key hard-coded somewhere.
That can trigger a catastrophic chain reaction, especially when those fundamental security controls, things like least privilege or encryption, are just missing.
It's like a domino effect.
Precisely. And we've categorized these failures, these organizational lapses, into 4 recurring archetypes. As we walk through the case studies, we'll show you exactly where things went wrong, even for really sophisticated companies.
Think of this as a shortcut, really. Distilling years of incredibly expensive mistakes into, hopefully, minutes of insight you can actually use. Okay, let's unpack this foundational idea first. It's the lens you have to use for every single incident we look at. The shared responsibility model.
If you operate in AWS, you have to understand this. Where does your responsibility start and where does Amazon's end?
It's the core doctrine, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the bedrock. AWS draws a very clear, explicit line. They talk about security of the cloud versus security in the cloud.
Okay, so security of the cloud, that's AWS's job.
That's their side of the bargain. Think physical security for the data centers, the actual hardware, the global network pipes, the underlying virtualization layer. That's what they guarantee.
Right. Physical locks, guards, redundant power.
All that stuff.
Yeah.
But the moment you spin up a service in EC2 instance and S3 bucket, security in the cloud becomes your problem.
Ah, okay, so that's data, apps.
Everything. Managing and securing your data, your applications, the operating systems you choose to install, all your network configurations, your firewalls, and, crucially, your entire identity and access management, or IAM, setup.
And that's where things go wrong.
Overwhelmingly, yes. This analysis confirms it. Almost every single high-profile breach we've looked at stems from a failure on the customer side of that line. It's the configuration, the setup, the management, not the core AWS infrastructure itself.
Which leads us straight into those 4 primary failure archetypes you mentioned, the patterns of customer-side mistakes we see over and over.
Let's start with maybe the most common and sometimes the hardest to fix once it happens. Archetype I, leaked credentials and API keys.
The classic, oops, I checked my keys into GitHub.
Exactly. It's that ubiquitous problem. A developer accidentally commits a sensitive AWS access key, maybe a long-term one, into a code repository. Sometimes it's public GitHub, sometimes it's even a private internal repo.
Doesn't matter if it's private.
Doesn't matter enough. Once those keys are out there, even in a private repo that gets compromised later, or if access controls are weak, they get harvested. There are automated bots constantly scanning for these things, and boom, unauthorized access.
Okay, that's archetype 1. What's number 2?
Archetype 2 is misconfigured cloud services.
Yeah.
This is about setting up the actual AWS services incorrectly.
Like leaving an S3 bucket wide open?
That's the poster child, yes.
Yeah.
Leaving S3 buckets public without the right policies.
Yeah.
But also misconfiguring things like a web application firewall or WGAVF, or, as we'll see in one case, leaving a Kubernetes admin console completely open, no password.
Wow, okay.
These are just fundamental access control failures, low-hanging fruit for attackers.
Then archetype 3.
Archetype 3, insider threats. This is a tricky one. It can be malicious.
Yeah.
A disgruntled employee or an ex-employee out for revenge or profit.
We're just careless.
Or just negligent. Someone bypassing security procedures because it's easier, or they don't understand the risk. And because insiders often have trusted access already, The potential damage is huge, and it can be really hard to spot early on.
Right. They're already inside the perimeter.
Exactly. And finally, archetype fourth, resource abuse. This is usually cryptojacking.
Where they steal your compute power.
Precisely. Attackers get in, often using methods from archetype I or 2, and then they hijack your powerful EC2 instances, not to steal your data, but to mine cryptocurrency.
So you don't lose data, but you get a massive AWS bill.
You get a crippling, unexpected bill. It's purely financial motivation for the attacker, but it can be devastating for the victim's budget.
Okay, so those are the 4 archetypes. How do they play out in a real attack?
We usually map them onto the typical attack cycle, sort of a framework to understand the progression. First, there's reconnaissance. The attacker finds the weak spot.
Looking for those open S3 buckets or leaked keys.
Yep. Then intrusion presence, they get that first foothold. Then comes lateral movement and privilege escalation. This is where they move around inside your environment, trying to get more access, find the valuable stuff.
Become admin.
Trying to become admin, exactly. And finally, exfiltration or action on objectives. They either steal the data, encrypt it for ransom, or maybe, like in the cryptojacking case, just use your resources. Or worse, delete everything.
Now, you mentioned something earlier, that even if the entry point is different, there's a common factor that makes things worse.
Yes, and this is critical. While the initial way in might be a leaked key one time, a misconfigured firewall another, the most consistent theme, the thing that amplifies the damage dramatically once they're inside, it's the failure of the principle of least privilege.
Meaning giving accounts or services way more permission than they actually need.
Exactly. Overly permissive IAM roles. If that initial compromised account or service only had the absolute minimum permissions required for its job, the attacker would be contained. They couldn't move laterally. They couldn't access the crown jewels.
So the initial mistake might be leaving the garage door unlocked.
Right. But the amplifying failure is finding the master key to the entire house just sitting on the workbench inside that unlocked garage. That master key, that's the IAM role, with permissions to read every database, delete every server, access every S3 bucket. That's what turns a small breach into a catastrophe.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Let's dive into a case that perfectly illustrates that idea of cumulative failure, multiple mistakes piling up. The Capital One breach in 2019.
Ah, yes, Capital One. This wasn't just a big data leak. It was like a security textbook case study in how fast things can unravel in the cloud.
The scale was just enormous.
Devastating. Over 106 million customer records, names, addresses, dates of birth. That's bad enough. But then you add about 140,000 social security numbers and roughly 80,000 linked bank account numbers.
Wow, that's direct, serious impact on people.
Huge impact. And the attacker, Paige Thompson, was actually a former AWS software engineer.
Which adds a layer, doesn't it? She knew how these systems worked internally.
It definitely adds complexity. She understood the services. Now, her defense later tried to argue it wasn't malicious, but her actions, bragging about it online, posting the data to GitHub, that clearly crossed the line. She was convicted later.
So technically, how did it happen? You said it wasn't just one thing.
No, it was a chain reaction. 3 distinct customer misconfigurations. Vulnerability number 1. Capital One had deployed a web application firewall, a WAF, which is a good idea, right? It's meant to filter malicious web traffic.
Standard practice.
Standard practice. But this WAF was misconfigured. It had a flaw in its setup that made it vulnerable to a specific kind of attack.
Okay, so the WAF itself wasn't inherently broken, just set up wrong by Capital One.
Correct. Which allowed for vulnerability number 2, a server-side request forgery attack, an SSRF.
Okay, break that down. SSRF.
Right, so basically an SSRF attack lets the attacker trick a vulnerable server, in this case, that misconfigured WAF, into making requests on the attacker's behalf to internal systems it normally wouldn't be able to reach directly.
So the WAF becomes like a puppet for the attacker inside the network.
Exactly. Thompson used this SSRF vulnerability to make the WAF talk to something called the EC2 Instance Metadata Service, or IMDS.
The IMDS, that gives information about the running server?
Yes, it runs on every EC2 instance and provides metadata. Crucially, it can also provide temporary security credentials for that instance. Thompson tricked the WAF into asking the IMDS, hey, what are my temporary security keys? And then relaying those keys back out to her.
Okay, so she got credentials, but surely temporary credentials shouldn't allow access to everything.
They absolutely shouldn't. And that brings us to the truly catastrophic vulnerability number 3, The overprivileged IAM role,
Ah, the amplifying factor.
the critical amplifying factor, those temporary credentials she obtained, they were associated with an IMM role assigned to that WAF instance, and that role had massively excessive permissions.
What kind of permissions?
The reports say the role could list and access sensitive data stored in S3 buckets. Think about that. Why on earth does a firewall component, whose job is filtering web traffic, need permission to read data inside S3 buckets across the account?
It makes no sense. That's a total violation of least privilege.
Complete systemic violation. POLP went out the window. Those temporary credentials, which should have been limited, effectively became a master key to all that customer data stored in S3.
So let's say, hypothetically, the WF was misconfigured, the SSRF did work, but the IMM role only had permissions to, I don't know, write log somewhere.
The attack would have stopped dead right there. She might have gotten those credentials, but they would have been useless for accessing the customer data in S3. The gross overprivilege is what turned the initial WAF error into a data heist.
Unbelievable. What about detecting this? Did alarms not go off?
That's another major failure point. The unauthorized access happened over several days back in March 2019. But Capital One's internal monitoring systems apparently didn't flag these unusual API calls coming from the wafer role accessing S3.
So it went unnoticed.
For months. It wasn't until July when an external security researcher stumbled upon the stolen data Thomson had posted publicly on GitHub that Capital One found out.
Months. Wow. That's a huge detection failure.
It's a severe indictment of their monitoring posture at the time. You need systems that can spot anomalous behavior like that.
And one more thing. The data in S3, was it encrypted?
That's the final kick. Much of the sensitive customer data, those SSNs and bank account numbers in the exposed S3 buckets, it was unencrypted at rest.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. Another critical failure. The final line of defense. If that data had been encrypted using something like AWS KMS, even if she managed to download the files, it would have been gibberish without the decryption keys.
So the lesson is crystal clear. It wasn't one thing.
It was cumulative failure.
Yeah.
Misconfigured WAF, plus SSRF vulnerability, plus an insanely overprivileged IAM role, plus failed monitoring, plus lack of encryption at rest. Any one of those controls, if implemented correctly, could have prevented or dramatically minimized the damage.
That's a sobering example. Let's shift gears slightly to another misconfiguration case, but with a different motive. Tesla, 2018. This was cryptojacking, right? Resource abuse.
That's right, Archetype 3. Here, the attackers weren't primarily after Tesla's data, though they did access some. Their main goal was stealing computing power for profit.
How did they get in? Was it another wave thing?
No, this was arguably even more basic, maybe even embarrassing, the entry point. A publicly exposed, passwordless Kubernetes administrative console.
Wait, passwordless just open to the internet.
Apparently so. Kubernetes is a container orchestration tool. Lots of people run it on AWS. But securing Kubernetes itself, that's 100% the customer's job under the shared responsibility model, leaving the main admin console wide open with no password.
That's like leaving the front door of your company headquarters unlocked and unguarded?
Pretty much, yeah. A fundamental access control failure.
Okay, so they walked into the Kubernetes cluster. What next?
Once inside, they quickly found another classic mistake, our archetype, my friend. They found exposed AWS access credentials hard-coded within a container pod running inside that Kubernetes cluster.
So a developer put AWS keys directly into the code or configuration of a container.
Seems like it. And those keys gave them access to the broader Tesla AWS environment. They poked around and did find a sensitive S3 bucket containing cart telemetry data, which they accessed.
But their main goal was cryptojacking.
Yes. But the really interesting part of the Tesla case, this sort of aha moment, was how stealthy they were about it, how they tried to evade detection.
Right, because usually cryptojacking maxes out the CPU, right? Makes servers run really hot and slow, easy to spot on monitoring dashboard.
Exactly. High CPU usage is the classic giveaway. These attackers were smarter. First, they configured their mining software for low CPU usage.
How low?
Low enough to probably stay below the standard alert thresholds administrators set up. Maybe not 100% CPU, but maybe 20%, 30%. Enough to make the money over time, but not enough to trigger a big red flag saying CPU pegged.
Sneaky. What else?
They also hid their network traffic. The mining software needs to connect back to a mining pool server. The attackers routed this connection through a content delivery network, a CDN, and used a non-standard port number.
Why does that help them hide?
Because traditional network monitoring often looks for traffic going to known malicious IP addresses, which a CDN can obscure, or traffic on specific ports commonly used by mining software, like port 80 or 443 might be allowed, but a weird high port might be blocked or flagged. By using a non-standard port in a CDN, their traffic blended in more easily.
Okay, so the lessons from Tesla are different from Capital One.
Definitely. Two key things. First, again, shared responsibility applies fully to third-party tools you deploy on AWS, like Kubernetes. You have to secure them properly.
Don't leave the admin console open with no password. Got it.
Right. And second, security monitoring needs to be smarter than just simple threshold alerts. Relying only on Alert Me if CPU hits 95% isn't enough anymore. You need more sophisticated tools, maybe behavioral analytics, that can spot subtle deviations from normal activity, not just the really loud, obvious stuff. So let's double-click on Archetype by now leaked credentials. We saw it play a role in Tesla, but the Uber breach from 2016 is probably the most infamous standalone example. It really shows what happens when old keys meet excessive permissions.
Okay, Uber 2016. What was the core technical failure there? Another GitHub mishap?
Yep. Hackers got access to a private Uber employee GitHub repository, and inside they found a hard-coded, long-term AWS access key.
Okay, hard-coded key, bad. But long-term, how long are we talking?
The reports indicate it hadn't been rotated since 2013.
Wait, 2013, and the breach was in 2016. That key was 3 years old.
3 years old. A single static master key sitting in code for 3 years. It's mind-boggling from a security hygiene perspective.
And I'm guessing it wasn't a restricted key.
Oh, absolutely not. That's the amplifying factor again. This ancient key had, and I quote, full administrative privileges over all data in the Amazon S3 data store. Full admin.
So again, least privilege completely ignored. A 3-year-old admin key left in a code repo.
Turned a simple code leak into a massive data catastrophe.
What was the impact? What data got exposed?
Data on 57 million users and drivers. Names, email addresses, phone numbers. And for about 600,000 drivers, their license numbers were also exposed.
And was the data encrypted this time?
Nope. According to the reports, the data was stored in an unencrypted manual backup file in S3. So once the attackers used that admin key to access the bucket, the data was just readable, plain text.
Ugh. So easy access, easy reading.
Depressingly easy. And look, Uber is the big name here, but this pattern is everywhere. Our sources mention similar incidents at Drizzly, DXC Technologies, Lynda.com, all involving AWS credentials committed to GitHub, public or private.
So the message is loud and clear. Don't put secrets in code, ever, even if you think the repo is private.
Treat every repository as potentially compromised. Use a proper secrets management solution. It's just not worth the risk.
Okay, that's the leaked credential problem. But there's a subtler issue that hits bigger companies, right? Sort of forgetting about things. Cloud sprawl.
Exactly. Which brings us to the Imperva breach. Imperva is a major cybersecurity company themselves, which makes this even more pointed. This incident highlights the danger of cloud sprawl, losing track of assets in your environment.
What happened there? How did they get breached?
The attacker managed to steal an administrative AWS API key, and they used that key to steal customer data emails, hashed passwords, even sensitive API, and TLS keys for Imperva's Cloud Waste customers.
Okay, stealing an admin key is bad. How did they get it? Was it GitHub again?
No, this time the entry point was almost mundane. It was a forgotten internal compute instance, an EC2 server.
Forgotten, like someone spun it up for testing and just left it running?
Apparently. It was created during a database migration back in 2017, wasn't needed anymore, but was somehow left running and critically publicly accessible from the internet. Just sitting there, an orphaned asset.
Pretty easy target.
A wide open back door, and that forgotten instance contained an exposed administrative API key.
Okay, so the neglect of the instance led to the key exposure.
Right. Once the attacker got that key, they used it to access a database snapshot. And this snapshot was also old, 2 years old, from 2017, and apparently hadn't been properly sanitized. It still contained sensitive production data from back then.
So multiple layers of failure again. A forgotten exposed server, an admin key left on it, and an old unsanitized database backup accessible with that key.
It's a trifecta of poor hygiene.
Yeah.
Asset neglect, key exposure, poor data lifecycle management.
And the detection. How long did it take Imperva to notice? Please don't say months again.
I wish I didn't have to. The data was actually stolen back in October 2018. The breach went completely unnoticed internally for 10 months.
10 months for a cybersecurity company?
10 months. They were only alerted in August 2019 when an anonymous third party found some of the exposed data and contacted them, apparently requesting a bug bounty.
That is Horrifying.
It really underscores the danger of cloud sprawl. The lesson is stark. You have to continuously track every asset in your cloud environment. Test instances, old migration servers, forgotten buckets. Anything that's not actively managed and secured is a potential backdoor.
You need that visibility. Automated discovery, maybe.
Absolutely. Continuous automated asset discovery and management is crucial. If you don't know it's there, you can't secure it, and eventually someone else will find it.
Okay, we've talked data loss, resource abuse, but some breaches go beyond that. They threaten the actual survival of the company. And the code spaces story from 2014, that's the ultimate nightmare scenario, isn't it?
It is the absolute cautionary tale. Every CTO, every business owner using the cloud needs to know the CodeSpaces story. They were a code hosting provider, kind of like a smaller GitHub.
They just disappeared.
Forced to cease trading, shut down completely,
Wow.
permanently.
What happened?
It started with an extortion attempt. An attacker gained access to their AWS control panel, the main management console, probably through compromised credentials, maybe phishing, possibly during a DDoS attack that served as a distraction.
Okay, so initial access via stolen credentials. Bad, but maybe recoverable.
You'd think so. CodeSpaces realized they were breached and tried to regain control by changing passwords, locking the attacker out.
It sucks. Fight back.
But the attacker had anticipated this. They had already created backdoor logins, maybe planted some persistent access keys. When they realized they were being locked out of the main console, they retaliated maliciously.
How?
They used those backdoor access points to systematically delete everything, all the company's data. S3 buckets wiped, EBS snapshots destroyed, machine images, AMIs deleted. They essentially scorched the earth in CodeSpace's entire AWS production environment.
Oh my God. But backups. Surely they had backups.
They thought they did. But here is the single, catastrophic, fatal mistake. Their backup snapshots, potentially S3 copies, were stored within the same AWS account and were apparently manageable and therefore deletable using the same compromised administrative credentials the attacker had.
So the attacker deleted the backups too.
They deleted the production data and the backups accessible through that same control plane, or at least enough of them that recovery was impossible.
So nothing left.
Nothing. No data, no code, no customer repositories, no way to rebuild. The company announced they were shutting down immediately. Game over.
Wow. The lesson there isn't even about the initial breach, is it?
Not primarily. The ultimate failure was the inability to recover. Relying solely on your primary cloud provider within the same administrative domain for both your production systems and your critical backups is an existential gamble.
You need separation.
You need true separation. Secure, ideally geographically separate, logically isolated backups that cannot be wiped out by the same event or credentials that compromise your production environment. It's the single most important control for business continuity. Your parachute, your lifeboat.
A truly chilling story. Okay, let's look at another kind of risk the supply chain. What happens when a vendor gets hit? The OneLogin breach in 2017.
Right. OneLogin is an identity and access management provider, an IDS company. They handle logins for thousands of other companies.
So they're like the gatekeepers. A breach there is. Bad news for everyone using them.
Exponentially bad news. They hold the keys to the kingdom for their customers. A compromise there has massive ripple effects.
How did the attackers get into OneLogin?
The vector here was interesting. It involved the compromise of a set of AWS keys belonging to a OneLogin service provider, a third-party vendor.
Ah, the supply chain weakness. Not OneLogin directly, but someone they trusted.
Exactly. A vulnerability in their extended network of trust. Once the attacker had those keys, they were able to access parts of OneLogin's AWS environment. Reports indicate they could access database tables containing sensitive user information and potentially access keys needed to decrypt customer data.
That sounds critical. How quickly did OneLogin detect it? CodeSpaces was immediate retaliation. Imperva was 10 months.
OneLogin was somewhere in between, but still worryingly slow for a security company. The breach apparently started around 2:00 a.m. Pacific time. Staff weren't alerted to the unusual database activity until 9:00 a.m. PST.
That's a 7-hour delay.
A 7-hour window where the attacker was active inside their systems before detection. In the world of incident response, 7 hours is an eternity. Significant damage can be done.
So the lesson there is about third-party risk and detection speed.
Absolutely. First, your security is only as strong as your weakest vendor link. You have to do rigorous due diligence on third parties with privileged access. And second, that detection lag highlights the need for robust, real-time monitoring, not just checking logs the next morning. You need automated alerts, behavioral analytics that spot anomalies as they happen to shrink that critical detection window.
Relying on someone noticing something unusual hours later is just too slow.
Way too slow, especially when dealing with identity providers.
Okay, one more case in this section, and we're circling back to Uber 2016, but not the key leak this time. You mentioned the cover-up.
Yes, this is about the organizational response, the corporate governance aspect, which turned out to be, in some ways, even more damaging legally than the technical breach itself.
What happened after Uber discovered the breach, after they knew the data was stolen?
This is where it gets really problematic.
Hmm.
Uber's chief security officer at the time, Joe Sullivan, found out about the breach relatively quickly. But instead of disclosing it as legally required, he allegedly orchestrated a plan to conceal it.
How do you conceal a breach involving 57 million people?
They paid the hackers $100,000, funneling it through their official bug bounty program, which is meant for rewarding ethical security researchers not paying off data thieves.
So they tried to make it look like a legitimate bug bounty payout.
Exactly. And they had the hackers sign a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, promising not to reveal the breach. Then, crucially, they actively concealed the incident for over a year, specifically from the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, which was already investigating Uber's data security practices from a previous incident.
Wow, that sounds like obstruction.
The courts agreed. This deliberate concealment was judged far more severely than the original technical failure of the key leak. It turned a data breach into a criminal cover-up.
What were the consequences?
Joe Sullivan was later convicted by a federal jury of obstruction of justice and misprision of a felony, basically knowing about a crime and actively hiding it. Uber itself paid a massive $148 million settlement to all 50 U.S. states. The courts made it clear, you can't use things like NDAs or bug bounty programs after the fact to whitewash illegal hacking or cover up a breach you're legally obligated to report.
So the lesson isn't technical here, it's ethical and legal.
It's about corporate governance, ethical leadership, transparency, and timely disclosure. The technical mistakes were bad, sure, but the organizational response, the cover-up, created this huge legal precedent about accountability. The cost of concealment ended up being far greater than the cost of the breach itself might have been if handled properly.
We keep coming back to it, don't we? If there's one single technical mistake that just dominates the statistics, it has to be Archetype 2, misconfigured services, and specifically Amazon S3 buckets.
It's almost depressingly common. It is by far the most frequent and, frankly, often the most easily preventable vulnerability we see across the board.
Frequent.
Our sources compiled a list of top incidents, and a shocking 7 out of the 10 involved S3 configuration errors leading to data exposure. 7 out of 10.
And these aren't like super complex nation-state attacks finding flaws in S3 itself?
No. These are almost always human errors, someone setting the permissions wrong. Using confusing legacy access control lists, ACLs, instead of modern bucket policies, or just making a mistake in a bucket policy and accidentally granting public read access to sensitive data.
Why is S3 so prone to this? Is it just too flexible?
Its flexibility is its power, but yes, that flexibility means the access control options are complex. Bucket policies, IAM policies, ACLs, access points.
Yeah.
There are many ways to control access, and if you don't fully understand how they interact, it's easy to make a mistake that leaves data exposed. A simple typo, a wrong principle.
And the scale of these leaks is just staggering.
It really is.
Yeah.
We're not talking small oopsies. Verizon, 14 million customer records, including PII and PINs exposed via S3. Accenture, internal strategy documents, client passwords. Dow Jones, 2.2 million customer PII records. Booz Allen Hamilton, sensitive U.S. Department of Defense files. Pegasus Airlines, 23 million files, including source code and crew PII.
It's like an epidemic of open buckets.
It really has been a consistent, recurring failure to implement basic access controls on one of the most fundamental cloud storage services.
So for someone listening right now, what's the immediate takeaway? The low-effort fix.
2 things. First, use automation. Implement automated tools that continuously scan your S3 buckets for public access or risky configurations. Don't rely on manual checks.
Tools like AWS Config, maybe, or third-party scanners.
Exactly. AWS config rules, GuardDuty S3 protection, third-party CSPM, cloud security posture management tools. Automate the detection. Second, and this is crucial, aggressively use the S3 block public access settings.
Ah, that's the account level override.
Yes. You can enable these settings at the AWS account level, and they act as a safety net. They will override individual bucket settings and simply prevent any bucket in that account from becoming public, regardless of its specific ACL or policy, unless you have a very specific audited reason for a public bucket, like hosting a public website, just turn block public access on everywhere. It's a huge safety improvement.
Okay, good practical advice. Now, briefly, let's touch on the human factor again, archetype third, insider threats. We focus so much on external hackers.
That we sometimes forget the risk from within. And insider threats are uniquely dangerous because they start from a position of trust. They often already have legitimate access, bypassing perimeter defenses.
We saw the Capital One attacker was a former employee, though that was more of an external attack using insider knowledge.
Yeah.
Are there cases of direct insider action?
Oh, yes. The source material mentions the Malindo air breach, 35 million passenger records exposed. That was attributed directly to former employees of a contractor who improperly handled the data.
So, poor offboarding maybe, access not revoked.
Likely poor offboarding procedures or inadequate data handling controls for contractors. We also saw another case mentioned, a former employee at a company called Vuva, who, apparently in retaliation after being fired, logged back in and maliciously deleted 23 of the company's production servers.
Just pure destruction.
Pure sabotage. It shows the motive isn't always financial. It can be revenge. It really highlights, as the source material bluntly puts it, you can't patch people.
Meaning you have to rely on technical controls.
You have to control their access and monitor their behavior. Apply zero trust principles don't automatically trust internal accounts. And most importantly, rigorous offboarding is non-negotiable. When someone leaves employee or contractor their access, all their access, especially privileged keys, must be revoked immediately, systematically, everywhere, production, test development, instantly. Okay, so we've walked through the horror stories, Capital One, Uber, Codespaces, Tesla, Imperva, OneLogin, all these different failure modes. But the good news is, the lessons learned point to a very clear, actionable roadmap for building better cloud security.
These are the things that, if they had been in place, would have changed the outcome.
Absolutely. These are the non-negotiables, the foundational controls that would have prevented, or at the very least, massively mitigated every single major incident we've discussed.
Let's start with the IAM failures we saw again and again, especially at Capital One and Uber. What's the core fix?
It's hammering home the principle of least privilege, POLP. It must be implemented rigorously for all users, all services, all applications, all roles.
No more LoveUFs that can read all S3 data.
Exactly. If a component doesn't need access to do its specific job, it doesn't get the permission. Use tightly scoped IAM policies. Review them regularly. If a permission isn't being used, get rid of it. Default deny.
And the absolute simplest, highest impact control to prevent stolen credentials from being easily used, like in Codespace's initial access.
Multi-factor authentication. MFA. Period. It has to be mandatory. Mandatory for root users, mandatory for all IAM users, especially those with any level of privileged access.
Just turn it on.
Just turn it on. Use hardware tokens, use authenticator apps. That simple step makes stolen passwords significantly less useful. If you run anything on AWS and your root account doesn't have MFA, honestly, stop listening and go fix that right now. It's that important.
Okay. Then there's the data itself. Uber, Capital One, leaving sensitive data unencrypted.
Again, non-negotiable. Data encryption. All sensitive data needs to be encrypted, both in transit, using TLS for network connections, and critically, at rest.
Meaning data sitting in S3 buckets, databases on disk volumes.
Yes, encrypt your S3 objects using SSE S3, SSE KMS, or SSEC. Encrypt your RDS database instances. Encrypt your EBS volumes attached to EC2 instances. Use services like AWS Key Management Service, KMS, to manage the keys.
Why is encryption so vital?
Because it's often your last line of defense. Think of it as a failsafe. Even if an attacker bypasses other controls, gets credentials, downloads the files. If the data itself is strongly encrypted, it's useless to them without the keys. It stops the impact cold.
Okay, those are foundational posture elements. What about detecting threats faster? Reducing that horrible dwell time we saw at Imperva and OneLogin.
You need proactive detection and monitoring. First, use the cloud-native tools. AWS provides powerful services like Amazon GuardDuty for intelligent threat detection. It uses machine learning to spot anomalies. And AWS CloudTrail for API logging.
CloudTrail is the audit log, right? Who did what, when?
Exactly. It's essential for forensics after an incident. But more importantly, you need continuous log monitoring of CloudTrail and other logs in near real time. You need automated alerts for suspicious API calls, for anomalous user behavior, for configuration changes.
So you catch things in minutes, not hours or months.
That's the goal. Reduce detection lag significantly.
And as Tesla showed us, simple alerts like CPU is high aren't enough for stealthy attacks.
Right. You need to move towards behavioral analytics. This means using tools, maybe guard duty, maybe third-party solutions that baseline normal activity for users and resources, and then alert on deviations from that baseline, even subtle ones.
Like the low CPU mining or someone accessing data they never touch normally.
Precisely. It's about spotting anomalies, not just crossing simple static thresholds. Security needs to be smarter today.
And for organizational survival, the code space's lesson, preparedness.
Absolutely critical. You must have a robust disaster recovery plan. And that means secure, validated, regularly tested backups that are isolated from your production environment.
Isolated meaning different AWS account, different region, offline.
Ideally, yes. Use cross-region replication for backups. Consider putting critical backups in a completely separate AWS account with different highly restricted credentials, and maybe even enabling things like S3 object lock and compliance mode to make deletion impossible for a set period. Don't let the same compromised admin keys that destroy production also destroy your only way back.
Test those recovery plans too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And an untested backup is barely a backup at all. You have to regularly test restoring from them to ensure they actually work.
Okay, last section, human and process controls. Avoiding the common pitfalls.
First, credential and secret management. We've said it before, but it bears repeating. Never, ever hard-code credentials, API keys, passwords, database strings in your code or configuration files.
Use tools like AWS Secrets Manager.
Yes, use AWS Secrets Manager, HashiCorp Vault, or similar dedicated tools. Store secrets securely, retrieve them dynamically at runtime, and crucially, enforce regular, automated rotation of these secrets. That 3-year-old Uber key should be a terrifying reminder.
And the imperva problem, the forgotten server, the cloud sprawl.
That requires asset management and cloud hygiene. You need continuous automated discovery of all your cloud assets, everything. EC2 instances, S3 buckets, databases, security groups, everything.
Find the orphans.
Find the orphans, find the neglected test environments, find the things that aren't being actively managed and secured, and then either bring them under management or decommission them. If you can't see it, you can't secure it, and it will eventually become a liability.
And related to the one login supply chain issue.
Vendor due diligence. Thoroughly vet the security practices of any third-party vendor that gets access, especially privileged access, to your systems or data. And don't just check once, monitor them continuously. Your security depends on theirs. #outro.
So after diving through all these incidents, all these failures, what's the big takeaway, the fundamental lesson for everyone listening?
It really boils down to this. Cloud security, especially in a major platform like AWS, is overwhelmingly about customer diligence. It's not usually about uncovering incredibly complex hidden flaws in AWS itself.
It's about the basics.
It's about the failure to consistently implement well-known fundamental security controls, the principle of least privilege, multi-factor authentication, data encryption, having actual tested, isolated backups. These aren't exotic concepts. They're Security 101.
And it's often cumulative, right? Not just one mistake.
Exactly. That's maybe the most profound insight. Security failures rarely happen in isolation. It's usually one small initial error that misconfigured WAF at Capital One, that forgotten server at Imperva, combined with a second failure, often that overprivileged IAM role, that turns a containable mistake into an enterprise-threatening catastrophe.
So resilience comes from layers, defense in depth.
Defense in depth, absolutely. The goal isn't just to build an impenetrable wall because walls eventually get breached. The goal is to build layers of control so that if one layer fails, another one catches the attack.
Like even if they steal the credentials, encryption should stop them reading the data.
Precisely. Or even if they compromise the server, a tightly scoped IAM role should prevent them from moving laterally or accessing sensitive data stores. Each key control, least privilege, MFA, encryption, backups needs to be strong enough, ideally, to stop the attack dead in its tracks, even if other controls have failed.
Which brings us right back to the start. If you take one thing away from Capital One and Uber, maybe check those legacy IAM roles today. See what permissions they really have versus what they need.
That's a great starting point. Huge potential impact. But if you take one thing away from the absolute terror of the code spaces incident, ask yourself this brutally honest question. If my entire AWS account, including all my snapshots and backups stored in that account, were maliciously deleted tomorrow morning, could my business actually recover?
Can you restore from somewhere else, truly isolated?
If the answer is no, or even I'm not sure, then honestly, that is your #1 priority. Forget optimizing IAM for a minute. Fix your disaster recovery and backup isolation first. That's your ultimate insurance policy. That's the control that lets you sleep at night, knowing even the worst-case scenario is survivable.
That's the challenge. A sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into decoding AWS security failures.
Thanks for having me. Hopefully folks found it useful.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.